The reality is, most men choose the bear too. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I am a licensed therapist and I have spent several years working with men and women who are victims and perpetrators of abuse. And as it relates to today's conversation, I'd like to talk with you about my experiences in working with men in particular. I spent many years working with men in prisons, and one of the things that I observed very quickly is, and I think I've spoken about this before, is that there is a hierarchy among sociopathic and psychopathic men. Like, there are some men, even though they may commit certain crimes, they'll look at that guy and, like, I would never do anything like what that guy's doing. And a lot of times they can be hypocritical, because they may have done the same thing to a lesser degree, if that makes sense. But one thing is certain amongst all the men, and probably the number one thing that most men that I worked with on my caseload would want as soon as they came into prison and throughout their entire time in prison, the number one thing that they would fight with me for is having a single cell. And a single cell is basically a cell with no one in it but them. And the reason being is because no one wants to live with another man and watch what goes on inside a penitentiary or correctional system, as we like to call it. And so men would never, even when doing like things like such as group therapy or, other things like that, men don't like talking to each other, right? And this is just in the correctional system. And I remember, like, even at certain times when there would be like challenges, like challenges doing when men would have challenges doing like everyday things like showering or like, basic hygiene or just basic things that they need to be doing on a day to day. One of the biggest challenges I would have would be with custody officers talking to inmate prisoners and saying, "Hey, why aren't you telling this guy, hey man, go shower? Why don't you get up and give this guy some soap, or do some things to like get these people motivated? If they're not showering, why aren't you trying to problem solve and figure out why these guys aren't doing their, why they aren't meeting their basic everyday needs?" And they're like, "I don't want to. That's not, I'm not going to do that." And so that would be like, something that I would talk to the men that I've worked with about specifically. And there would be the biggest argument. But what I've noticed is like all of these men would be in this room and none of them like to talk to each other. And it would have to be something in where I worked really hard to create safety in the spaces, even within the correctional system. So eventually we got there, but they would, they may, talk, we may be in group therapy and they would still try to talk to me, as opposed to each other for a cohesive conversation. And eventually, like I said, we got to a place where cohesiveness was a thing, but there was a lot of guardedness. And I know that there's a lot of you watching this video saying, well, okay, Dr. Jones, you're just talking about men in prison. It's natural that men in prison wouldn't want to talk to each other. True, and I give you that, but I've also noticed it in certain situations when I'm working with men and men will not talk to each other, where I have, been in situations in families, in family where you see a man who's doing wrong, um, and they won't step to that man and put him in his place and say, hey man, what you're doing is wrong. Your behavior is inappropriate. If you're mistreating a female, your behavior is inappropriate. And the reality that, again, I've noticed, or even like, people not going to work, or not, doing the job correctly. Like, you need to get your ass up and go to work, or you need to go back and do your job, or like, put boundaries and expectations on other men. They do not do that. And what they do is they kind of buddy up and talk, laugh and sort of compare notes. And I won't say that this is all men, because it's certainly not. But what I've noticed is that more and more I'm seeing that men do not, they are afraid of each other. And this is actually a conversation that I ultimately ended up having as part of, really deep therapy discussions. Like, you are afraid of other men. And the reality is, I think a lot more men are afraid of men than they would care to admit. And again, this isn't meant to be a blanket statement for all men, but just an observation that I've noticed over the years, and actually some things that I've been able to do a lot of therapeutic work with. And I always say, to women, or just anybody really that's surrounding themselves with men, and even as a caveat to women who sort of go to these male coaches, I think it should be a red flag. It is a red flag automatic off top across any situation. If you encounter a man who says, well, I can't talk to other men, I can't coach or counsel another man, my market is always women. Usually, in my experience, it's almost always predatory. And I would even go so far as to say I do find that is very predatory when you have a man that says, I cannot talk to another man. I'm only gonna, talk to women because they get me.